Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Evanson. I'm the Science Communications Specialist with the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, or NAFSE for short. Now, we are part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. We're one of 15 exchanges across the country, and you can see them there on the map. And if you want to learn anything about the other exchanges or the Joint Fire Science Program itself, you can go to firescience.gov. Now, one of the things that NAFSE does best is we bring people together to share fire science information. And a perfect example of that is today's mini-symposium from our Fire and Fire History Working Group. Now, before I turn it over to the group, here are just a couple of items to note. So today's symposium is going to be recorded and will be available on our website tomorrow. You're going to hear from 3 speakers today, which will take about an hour, and then we will use the remaining time for a question and answer session. Now, at any time during the speakers' time, you can put your questions into the chat, and we will use those to steer the question and answer session. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie Glover.
All right, thanks so much, Eric. We certainly appreciate you and all of the support that we get for NAFSE for the working group. So my name's Katie Glover. I'm one of the co-leads for the working group. I have a research background in paleoecology. I'm an external associate with the Climate Change Institute at University of Maine, and fire dynamics at all time scales in northeastern ecosystems remains my primary research interest. In my career now, I do a lot of focus on education and outreach program development, and I serve as the Associate Director for Environmental Education Programs at Stanford's Biological Reserve. So I live and work in California, and that's where I'm calling in from this morning. I'm going to pass to our other co-lead, John Neely, and let him introduce himself too.
Good morning, everybody. I retired from the U.S. Forest Service in 2024 after a career in wildfire suppression and fire management. I now work for the New Hampshire Division of Natural and Cultural Resources as a community wildfire mitigation specialist, helping towns and other entities reduce wildfire concerns. And I'm also involved in research into past fire history of our region. I'll take a minute to share the goals of our working group. This working group is a space for exploring connections between fire ecology, climate, cultural traditions, and outreach, with the broader goal of shaping the future of fire-adapted landscapes. We seek to build a community of fire practitioners, ecosystem managers, researchers, educators, and the interested public in order to build a knowledge base of fire history covering at least the last millennium, discuss emergent tools, data, and perspectives to enrich our understanding of indigenous fire use, fire effects on regional landscapes, and how the last century of altered fire management has and will continue to influence ecological patterns and processes in our region. Key outcomes are to inform fire management through co-production of research and to support public engagement on the future of fire in a warming world.
Great, thanks for reiterating that, John. I'd also like to recognize our other co-lead for the working group is Chris Gitterman, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. We've huge credit to him for really almost completely organizing and facilitating the first mini-symposium that we had. And we like that model, and clearly so does everyone else in the community based on how many registered today. So huge credit to him. All right. So with that said, we can get started with our program. I'll remind folks that we'll have the 3 speakers first and then Q&A at the end. You can drop questions in the chat at any time. We'll go through those at the end. So ask your questions as you think of them. It does help us if you identify who it's for or what topic you want us to return to when we do that at the end. All right. All right. So I'm thrilled to introduce Andrew Barton, who will be our first speaker. He is a forest and fire ecologist, science writer, and professor of biology at the University of Maine at Farmington. His research focuses on increasing aridity, wildfire, and forests in the Southwest USA, northern Mexico, and Maine, using multiple approaches, including field demography, dendrochronology, plant physiology, and remote sensing. As part of a team based at Northern Arizona University, Drew is working on a project funded by NASA on the effects of mechanical thinning on drought resilience in ponderosa pine in Northern Arizona. He's also part of an interdisciplinary team exploring the cultural and ecological significance of large springs emanating from the Edwards Aquifer in Texas. Finally, he's working on a binational project with US and Mexican scientists aimed at restoring the endangered plant Guadalupe fescue in Big Bend National Park in Coahuila, Mexico. Drew is an author of The Changing Nature of the Maine Woods and co-editor of Ecology and Recovery of Old Growth Forests in Eastern North America. He's worked for many years with Maine science and environment groups, including the State of Maine Climate Council Science Committee, Maine's Ecological Reserve System Science Advisory Board, and the New Maine Biodiversity Assessment. So Drew, when you are ready, feel free to share slides and take it away.
Well, thanks so much to Katie and Eric and John and Polly and NAFSE for putting this on. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other two speakers and to seeing your questions from all of you out in Zoom land. I'm going to talk today about pitch pine woodland in Midcoast Maine, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our research about a decade ago on fire, land use, and long-term dynamics. Let me start with my collaborators on this research. Andrea Nurse, who you will be hearing from shortly, is at the Climate Change Institute, and the other three collaborators are former students of mine who have gone on to develop their own illustrious careers. Now, pitch pine, Pinus rigida, is a globally rare species. Here's its distribution. And it occurs in xeric, very open habitats that are unusual in this sort of largely mesic northeast area. These open areas, these xeric areas, are critical habitat for a suite of species that are uncommon themselves that depend on these habitats, especially pollinators, but also birds, mammals, and reptiles and amphibians as well. Pitch pine is highly xerophytic, meaning it's very drought resistant. It occurs in dry places. It's very shade intolerant, which means it's disturbance dependent. We worked in Midcoast Maine, specifically in the Nature Conservancy Basin Preserve, which is a couple thousand acres right along the coast. This is an area that, like much of New England and much of the Northeast, was cleared for pasture starting in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then most of these areas, all of these areas in the Basin Preserve were abandoned somewhere between 1850 and 1950. More on that a little bit later. One of the really cool things about the Basin Preserve and much of the Phippsburg Peninsula where it occurs, which is, by the way, south of Bath, is that it has these narrow ridges that run southwest to northeast. And they're not very wide, they're not very high, only about 10 or 20 meters high, and they are interrupted in between by these basins. And so what this does is it establishes over very short distances these very steep environmental gradients, exactly what we ecologists love to see and the kind of system we love to work in. Here are some photos on the right side to give you a sense of what this looks like. So the ridge tops are very exposed, lots of pitch pine, the slopes a little bit more mesic, lots of pitch pine still, and then the basins, much or no pitch pine, and moist to really hydric. Pitch pine is a fire-adapted species. Many populations, but not all, including not in the basin, have serotinous cones, meaning, of course, that the cones stay sealed shut until the heat generated by fire melts the resin and opens up the scales. Seeds fly into the air, the fire passes through, they float to the ground, seeds germinate and create a new stand of pitch pine. Pitch pine has the capacity to resprout along the stem and the root collar after stem death from fire, cutting, whatever. I wouldn't really call it a particularly fire-resistant species, not like ponderosa pine or longleaf pine, but when they get large, they get thick enough bark so that they can survive fires that are not too high in intensity. And the cool thing about this is they actually form fire scars and this has been increasingly used to reconstruct fire history, especially in the southern and central parts of its range. Here's an example from Flatley et al., 2013, from the Linville Gorge area in western North Carolina. Now, one of the really interesting things about pitch pine population dynamics in regards to fire is that it varies over environmental gradients. Let's start in the center, and I want you to think about a place like the New Jersey Pine Barrens. Very xeric, sandy soils, lots of fire, very frequent fire, and this gives rise to polymodal cohorts. What I mean by that is patches of pitch pine that are different ages, and their ages correspond to when the last fire occurred. Now, in sites that are a little bit more mesic, like in the Southern Appalachians, for example, fire is much less frequent, and although still really, really important, because these fires remove cover from competing more shade-tolerant species, and they also expose mineral soil, which is essential for seed germination of pitch pine, and they create a new stand. Now that stand develops over time, and then you get colonization by more shade-tolerant species, and slowly but surely you get succession to these more shade-tolerant, more mesophytic species over time. And then another fire comes through and starts the process over again. So this creates these cyclical populations. Now, if we go to the far left side, there are some sites that are extremely xeric, like extensive rock outcrops, where you will find pitch pine and no evidence of fire, and you will find persistent populations despite a lack of disturbance, what we used to call climax stands. So really fascinating, this variation across environmental gradients in pitch pine dynamics and fire, and something we explored in the Basin Preserve. A little bit more on pitch pine history. So we know from pollen that pitch pine migrated to southern New England from south of there about 10,000 years ago. We don't know that much about northern New England, though. There's lots of evidence of all kinds for a major role of fire over thousands of years. But again, less is known for the northern part of the range. In the 1800s, Euro-American clearing and harvesting, and then farm abandonment was really good for pitch pine. So more pitch pine, and in fact, pitch pine expanded into some sites that where previously it was outcompeted by more shade-tolerant species. Contemporary times, with fire suppression and a lack of disturbance in many areas, there's now successional replacement of pitch pine by more shade-tolerant oaks, maples, and white pine, kind of part of that whole mesification process that's going on in Eastern North America. Here are the three questions that we asked in this research. Number one, was pitch pine present before Euro-American settlement? This may seem like a strange question, but you know, the assumption when there's an investment of conservation effort in, on a species or on a type of ecosystem, the assumption is that it's not an artifact of Euro-American settlement, that it actually is an intrinsic part to these natural systems. So we tested that hypothesis. Second, we wanted to know whether pitch pine is associated with fire in the paleoecological record. And then finally, we want to know, does pitch pine actually need fire in the Basin Preserve? In other words, does the Nature Conservancy need to do some active management if they want to maintain this type of ecosystem? So there are three questions, not easy questions to answer. So we felt like we needed multiple lines of evidence, and we wanted to see how those multiple lines of evidence converged on answers to these questions. So 4 lines of evidence, 4 different methods. I'll talk about pollen and charcoal, modern fire, age structure, and pitch pine regeneration. First, pollen and charcoal. We took sediment cores from small forest hollows. And let me tell you something really important right now. I got to participate in the glamorous part of paleoecology, and that is extracting these sediment cores. Andrea did all the work. So Andrea, with her skills, and you'll hear more about these in just a little while, she's the one who did all of the pollen identification and counting and charcoal, et cetera, et cetera. So we dated 9 different levels to develop an age depth curve using Bicron. I have to say we probably needed more levels in retrospect. We quantified at 26 different levels of the sediment core, large pieces of charcoal, because we were interested in local fire, not regional fire. We identified pollen by species, and the goal of all this is to sample the local environment for charcoal and species, in particular pitch pine, as far back as we can possibly go. We wanted to have some information on modern fire history, 20th century, late 19th century. We did find 5 fire-scarred pitch pines, so we took sections, sanded them, aged the rings, and dated some fires, as you will see. We also did a historical search for fires in Maine, in compilations of historical fires, especially in Coolidge's History of the Maine Woods. We took age structures from pitch pine and associated tree species in 5 different sites, and we wanted to know, when did these stands originate? Really what that question is asking is, when were these pastures abandoned, and when did the forest begin to reconstitute itself? But we also want to know, how old are the oldest pitch pines that are occurring, especially on these ridgetop sites. We also wanted to know a lot about pitch pine regeneration. There's been a lot of work on this in the southern and central parts of its range, but less in the northern part. So we sampled in 20 plots, ridges, slopes, and basins. We recorded pitch pine regeneration, and we recorded all environmental factors we thought might be relevant to pitch pine regeneration. Okay, on to the results. If you look at the very far left, you can see that that is the continuum from the top of the sediment core, so that's today, and it goes back 9,000 years, which is awesome. And then you'll see in that red rectangular box next to that, you see charcoal and Pinus rigida, which is pitch pine. You'll see a 20X next to pitch pine. And let me tell you what that means. One of the key findings of the paleoecological research is that pitch pine occurred at every single one of the 26 levels, but all the way back 9,000 years, but never was it abundant. Always a very minor species during that time. So we had to magnify it 20-fold in order to actually see the bars well. Now, a tiny bit of background. So 8,000 to 10,000 years ago in Maine, the Northeast, New England, etc., was the warmest, the driest, and the most fiery period in the Holocene, at least up to more recent times. And you can see we have 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, there's a peak in charcoal and there's a peak in pitch pine abundance. And then pitch pine and fire not very common until Euro-American settlement times, where we get several peaks of charcoal and we get a lot of pitch pine during that time period. Now, if you look to the right, you'll see ambrosia and rumex. Those are markers for extensive Euro-American clearing and development and all of those things. We found that pitch pine accumulation rates were positively, statistically significantly related to charcoal accumulation rates. So in other words, fire was really important to regulating the abundance of pitch pine through this 9,000-year period of time. Okay, on to modern fires. Really exciting to look down that list and see in 1926 that there was a large fire, 6,900 acres on Phippsburg Peninsula. Phippsburg is the peninsula where the basin occurs, south of Bath. And so what I did a lot of search in newspapers in that area to see if I could find evidence for that fire. And there were tons of articles on that fire because it was very large and quite serious. Here is one in particular. So let me see if I can close this. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So this is from the Bath Independent, September 2nd. The fire started a week ago Monday in the northeast corner of a woodlot owned by Freeman H. Merritt, north of his Sabasco property and known to old residents as the Basin Woods. Many articles about this fire. Clearly, this fire burned through what is today called the Basin Preserve. Now, our 5 fire-scarred trees, we found evidence of 4 fires. 3 of the trees have a fire scar in 1926. Clearly, these are all the same fires. Really interestingly, this is a little segment from a topo map from 1950 of the study area. And look at the names of these ridges, Burnt Ledge and Burnt Ledge Junior. Very, very creative names, as you can see. But, evidence that fire continued to burn into the 20th century. And in fact, I would say compared to much of Maine that there's higher fire risk in this place because there are dry spots, there's lots of fuel as well. Here are the age structure data. Let's ignore species for now. What this is showing is pasture abandonment and the reconstitution of the forest there. And you can see that that started in the early 1900s. The other really interesting thing this shows is that there are some old pitch pines that predate pasture abandonment. So in other words, farmers were leaving some of these old pitch pines. All of these old pitch pines are on the ridge tops. They're kind of gnarled, probably not great wood for different purposes, but you can speculate, lots of speculations about why they might have left these there. But an interesting result. This shows the conditions at the three topographic positions. Remember, there's ridge, slope, and basin. And we measured, again, all the things we thought might be relevant to pitch pine regeneration: soil depth, canopy openness, organic matter. TRMI is an index of xeric to mesicness, soil pH, shrub cover. And let me make this a little easier for you. I'm highlighting the ridges here. And really what we found clearly is that the ridges are very open, they're very dry, and they have very shallow soil. There are a lot of shrubs there too, a lot of shrubs on the slopes as well. Now, I have to say, if any of you walked around this area, you would figure this out without sampling anything at all. But of course, we're scientists, so we have to take data and we have to actually show that it is true. So clearly, the ridges and the slopes and the basins are very different in their environment. We had 20 plots, remember, and we had cover for all tree species in these 20 plots. So we did a non-metric, multi-dimensional scaling analysis of woody plants. Ignore the vectors for right now, only look at the circles, and you'll see that along the first axis of the NMDS, that you'll notice in the green circles, those are for ridge plots. The other side on the far right, the red plots are for the basin, and in between are the slope plots. So clearly, species composition in these 20 plots across these positions differentiates really well according to topographic position. Well, what are these correlated with in terms of environmental factors? No big surprise at all. And that is that, again, the ridge tops are open, they're dry, and they're shallow soil. And those seem to be the most important variables. So in general, species composition clearly differentiates across the three topographic positions and across this environmental gradient of environmental variables. This is the last slide of data. At the top, this is percent cover of the canopy. This is like what the forest is made up today. The bottom is percent abundance of juveniles for a tree species. I've grouped a few of them together, so the birch species and tolerant hardwoods. Tolerant hardwoods are mainly red oak and red maple. And so what we see on the left are the ridges, in the middle are the slopes, and on the right side are the basins. Let me again help you a little with this. So this highlights pitch pine. What you can see in terms of percent cover of the canopy is that the ridges are pretty much pitch pine. The slopes are about half pitch pine and then half tolerant hardwoods and white pine and a few other species as well. And then the basin, no pitch pine at all, and a real mix of species down there. Now, what's interesting is then to compare this with the regeneration at the bottom. And basically what you can see is that lots of pitch pine in the canopy on the slopes, but almost no regeneration in the understory by pitch pine. What's coming in there is red oak and red maple and white pine as well. So we're witnessing the beginning of a successional process there that's going to slowly lead to these more shade tolerant species. The other really interesting things is that if you look at the lower half and you look at the left side where the ridge is, 60% of the juveniles are pitch pine, but notice that there is some colonization by red oak and red maple and white pine. And so some encroachment is beginning on these xeric pitch pine woodlands. Finally, we ran some models for, well, what are the main probable drivers of regeneration of pitch pine? Soil depth and canopy openness jump out. This makes a lot of sense. Soil depth is really important in the sense that shallow soil depth on the ridges is what is keeping out the competitors for pitch pine. Canopy openness is really, really important because pitch pine is a highly shade intolerant species. All right, let me draw some conclusions from this. First of all, in terms of the chronology, pitch pine has persisted for at least 9,000 years, but always as a minor species in the basin. Fire is clearly an important driver of abundance. Euro-American clearing and then farm abandonment created more fire, more disturbance, more pitch pine as well. Currently, because of fire suppression and because of a lack of disturbance, we're having reversion to sort of Euro-American pre-settlement conditions in terms of the vegetation. The dynamics of pitch pine populations clearly varies across these steep environmental gradients. In moist basins, pitch pine is outcompeted by shade-tolerant species on the slopes. They established after farm abandonment, but now they're being replaced by shade-tolerant species on the xeric ridgetops. There are persistent climax stands, if you will, but some colonization by shade-tolerant species. What does this mean about the future and about conservation? Well, if conservation of pitch pine woodlands is a priority, then probably Nature Conservancy will need to do some prescribed fire or thinning. But if carbon retention reverting to past conditions is a priority, could allow succession to proceed. There probably will always be at least a little bit of these stable pitch pine woodlands on the ridgetops, at least. Well, with that, I will move on to our next presentation. Thanks so much for your attention. Look forward to hearing your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Drew. Awesome presentation. And you are getting some good questions that have started to populate the chat. We'll get to those. But for now, let's go ahead and transition to our next speaker, who is Andrea Nurse. She is a Palynology Research Associate at the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute. She has over 25 years experience as a contract palynologist in the fields of paleoecology, archaeology, wetland ecology, bee pollination, and pollen taxonomy. Her range of pollen expertise includes temperate and Arctic North America and Northern European flora, as well as pollen from plants typically foraged by honeybees and bumblebees. Currently, she's working with Acadia National Park, Schoodic Institute, and the Wabanaki Alliance to establish a 6,000-year vegetation history of freshwater wetlands in Acadia National Park to help guide co-stewardship of the Great Meadow restoration. So yeah, we look forward to hearing about all of that, Andrea. Take it away and share slides when you're ready.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Drew, for a great lead-in to a general discussion about how we can use pollen, both for resource management and for environmental restoration. Well, let me see. Is this sharing okay? Because I'm not moving.
Let's see, so we can see your first slide just fine.
Okay. The problem is I
right
can't
arrow
get to my
key.
second slide.
Did you start the presentation to put it in presentation mode? Otherwise, it won't go forward.
Okay. Well, there.
There you go. We can see
Okay.
it fine.
Yep, I think I've got it. So I'm just going to give an overview of how and why pollen can really enhance ecological studies associated with fire. All flowering plants produce pollen, and flowering plants are everything from pine trees to dandelions. And pollen is part of the sexual reproduction. It's the equivalent to a male sperm, and it's produced on the stamens of the flowers. It's carried by or distributed by either wind or insects or water to other open flowers, and when the pollen lands on the stigma, it sends down a pollen tube and basically fertilizes the ovary and leads to seed development. Pollen can be distinctive to family, to genus, and occasionally to species. And we work really hard to get it the best identification or the highest identification that we can. Wild rice or the grasses are an example of a family that generally we can only identify to family. There are a few grasses such as wild rice or corn or calamagrostis that are distinctive. But in general, grass pollen, it's round, it has a single pore, and it has a collar, or what we call an annulus, around that pore. The Asteraceae and the rose families are another example of often we can only get to family and then maybe to genus. However, there are species here in the Northeast that we can take to species, and pine and spruce we can distinguish in the Northeast 4 types of pine and 3 species of spruce, thanks to some really extensive taxonomy and cat-analysis studies that we've run in the past. One of them was one that Drew and I worked on together for the pines. Pollen grains they're distinguished by their size, their shape, the apertures, the number of furrows or the number of pores on the pollen cell, and by the sculpturing of the exine, or that external shell around the outside of the pollen grain. And there's just some examples here. Maple, when I say it has sculpturing on it, you can see that maple has furrows, and the placement and arrangement of the furrows plus the size of the cell can help distinguish which type of maple it is. Birch is an example of a pollen grain it has 3 pores, and the pores protrude out from the cell. Ragweed is a member of the Asteraceae, and it has spines. It also has pores and furrows that are kind of difficult to see, but the spines on the ragweed are very blunted, as opposed to other members of the Asteraceae where the spines are very distinct and pointed. Lakes, peatlands, and forest hollows act as archives for pollen that is airbound or carried by insects. The pollen and other plant material gets deposited in lakes. They settle into the bottom of the lakes or onto the wetlands. And as more sediment forms, it's in these moist conditions, it's anaerobic enough so the pollen or seeds or conifer needles, all of these things are preserved within the sediment. When we take sediment cores from these environments, it allows us to have a chronological record of what the landscape looked like at the time of deposition. Peatlands they have better chronology than lake cores because there's less bioturbation within a peatland, whereas you get some mixing within lake cores. When we core from a peatland, we often use what's called a Russian core, and it gives a half round core. When we core from small ponds or lakes, we use it's a Livingston piston core. And what happens is we drive the piston We put the core down into the sediment, and there's an image of a piston corer on the right. You drive the point of the piston down into the sediment, and then you push the casing, either the clear polyglass casing or a metal casing, down around the piston. And it's very much like putting your finger on a straw when the straw is in water and it holds the sediment within. You extract the core, and then you extract the sediments from that core casing on the left. Now, this core didn't come from Comstock Lake in Wisconsin. It happened to come from Lake Auburn, but that first, it shows what you get for that first loose sediments. And when we extract that, we push it up from the bottom, and we'll scoop off layer by layer, usually either 1 centimeter at a time, until we have sampled the entire core. Cores from further down within the sediment are firm and are extracted and just simply stored until it comes sample time. They're stored at 5 degrees in a cooler. One of the things that is important when you're designing your question or your research project, you need to take into account what your catchment area is, or what area do you want to study your changes in vegetation. The small hollows, like Drew just explained, that core site will pick up pollen from about a 50-meter circumference around the site. Small ponds or lakes, you figure your catchment for the pollen is about 8 times the size of the lake that you're coring. For larger questions, we can get cores from anything from Mary Meeting Bay, which has both the Kennebec and the Androscoggin River emptying into it to look at a broad view of Maine, to the Gulf of Maine, to ocean cores. There's really no limit for distribution size. You just need to have a core site that's appropriate to your research question. At Comstock Lake, that study was looking at fluctuations in the fuel source between in southern Wisconsin, looking at fuel sources in forested areas as opposed to prairie areas. Once you have the core, once we have a core, it's a pretty intensive process to isolate the pollen from the sediments. And we start by taking samples, and the sample size is anywhere from 0.5 to 2 centimeters of sediment. We deflocculate or break up the sediment itself, add a marker bead, a calibrated number of beads, so that we can not only figure percentage, but we can also figure pollen concentration and accumulation. We sieve it to get out the coarse particles, and then we remove those fine clays and sands, either by floating the pollen away from the clays or dissolving the silica particles, the clay and sand, with hydrofluoric acid. After that's done, we remove the cellulose from the outside of that pollen casing, from the exine by acetylysis. We filter it once more time. We dehydrate it to get all the water out using tertiary butyl alcohol. And then we put the residual pollen into silicon oil, both to preserve it and to provide a mounting fluid. Once all that is done, we'll place a drop of the pollen concentrate onto a slide, a glass slide, put a cover slip over it, and examine it under a 400 magnification with a light microscope. We count anywhere from 300 to 400 pollen grains. And as we're counting, we identify each grain to the highest level that we can. And then traditionally, the traditional way of looking at the pollen record is with a pollen percent diagram. And what you have in front of you is, it's called a Tilia diagram. And I call it traditional way. We've used Tilia diagrams for years now to represent the pollen mix within the forest. So this diagram shows, let's see, it shows transitions in forest type. And the first thing that we can see is that 11,000 years ago, spruce was the dominant forest type in this particular core. 11,000 years ago, we were in a 1,000-year cold period called the Younger Dryas. The glaciers had melted back. We'd been through a warm period, but then it got cold again. And as we came out of that cold period at the start of the Holocene, spruce disappeared from most of the landscape away from the cooler down East Coast. So like central Maine, spruce pretty much died out, and it was replaced by pine. As the pine decreased with warming, oak came in. And we began to see more birch. And then at the very top of the core, on your right-hand side, ambrosia appears. Ambrosia is ragweed. Ragweed is a native flora to Maine, and it responds, or to the northeast, and it responds to disturbance. So when you start getting agricultural practices, particularly grazing or lumbering, or it can respond to fire as well. But agricultural practices is when we see this peak. So if we know the date of settlement and we get an ambrosia peak, we can place that date as to the start of European settlement in the Northeast. So this is an example of percentage. More and more now, we're moving away from using percentages and using either pollen concentration or pollen accumulation. This graph is an example of having both percentage and accumulation rates. And this was a study of wild rice in the St. Louis estuary. There were two questions that they asked. Number one was, how long had the wild rice been there in the estuary? And what was happening at the top of this core, where you see that distinct peak in wild rice and then an abrupt decline. On this graph, we also show sediment accumulation rates, and we used phytoliths as a fire indicator. If we look at the ambrosia increase, that's down Ambrosia came in around 1853. So in that area, that is when logging particularly began around the estuary. We had an increase in fire, but there really wasn't much change in the wild rice until we got up to somewhere in the late 1900s. And what we see is a decrease in sedges, the Cyperaceae that you see in the middle of the core, an increase in wild rice, and then somewhere between 2003 and 2014, the populations crashed. Because of the change in sedges, so as water levels rise, the sedge level moves back around the pond, and you have less pollen. So the sedge rim is decreased, and aquatics increase. And it's on your very further right-hand side of this. It's subtle, but you can see that happening. So water increased, but then water levels decreased once again. The University of Minnesota put this record along with the record of water level changes. And what they found was water level was decreasing. But the other thing that was happening is that the use of large motorboats on the estuary was increasing and causing wakes. And in this particular location, the combination of decreasing water levels and increasing lakes was creating shifts in the water level to the point where it was damaging the wild rice plants. So the third way that we're using more and more now is looking at pollen accumulation levels. And this is the graph that you just saw in Drew's presentation. It doesn't show the sediment accumulation levels, that is important when you're looking at pollen accumulations, because pollen accumulation is the number of pollen cells per centimeter per year. When you have increased sediment accumulation, as we do between 400 years and to present on this, it's going to appear that you have more pollen grains present. So as Drew explained, Pinus rigida was present all through this period. If you just look at the graph without taking accumulation rates into effect, it looks like there was a big increase in the pine during the last 400 years. Not necessarily true. And Drew correctly interpreted this as persistent and responsive to the charcoal. When you're working in forested areas like Matthews Pond is a little pond with no inlet, no outlet, located in Piscataquis County. For forested areas, percentage of growth works very well to show what's changing on the landscape. If you're working in an area, or if you're looking at a particular species, the concentration rates or the accumulation rates give you a much better view of what's going on that landscape. Now, having said all that, when you take pollen and these pollen diagrams and you add other proxies, other factors into them, you can read what is going on in the landscape much easier. For example, this diagram, which I know is very busy, but it includes water balance or lake levels. It includes charcoal. And by combining just those two mediums with the pollen, we can read a record like it shows on the right-hand side. The Younger Dryas, that cold period between 11,000 and 12,000 years ago, the water levels were low. And that's the graph on the further left-hand side. And the y-axis is time and depth. So where you see those peaks, that's where the water level was low. During the YD, white spruce was the dominant species, and it's a little blip in the middle of the diagram there. Now, as the climate warmed and we moved into the warm Holocene, that spruce disappeared from the record, especially in mid-Maine. If we look carefully, you can see the charcoal peaks are followed by rises in the lake level and increases in birch. Makes perfect sense, because if you've got fire within the catchment area, then you've got increased runoff into the lakes. And birch is an early successional species, often follows fire. About 5,000 years ago, in the middle of the graph where you see that big peak in water balance, water levels declined in Maine, or well, throughout Maine, for as much as 5 meters. And that drought time lasted 1,000 years. And not only was it drier, but it was warmer. And at the same time, hemlock crashed. And this hemlock crash was time transgressive, starting in the Midwest and working its way eastward. And it coincided with this start of this drought period. Further up the core, increasing lake levels with increasing wildfires. And then we had a resurgence of spruce. The spruce came back into the pollen record somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 years ago, depending on the site that you're looking at. And that coincides with a decrease in temperature of 1 degree centigrade. Finally, at the top of the core, and it's really hard to see, and you almost have to take my word for it on this, but ragweed increased. And that coincides with increased logging, or when logging began up in that section of Piscataquis County. So what questions can we use pollen studies to address? Well, what species respond to fire, as Drew showed us? What species are sensitive or resistant to shifts in temperature and or hydrology? And an example of that is the hemlock decline that coincides with drought periods. What species respond to abrupt climate fluctuations? And how is the forest or the prairie or the tundra vegetation changing over time? And what is it that's driving these changes? And moving away from that, questions of natural landscape and looking at the needs of agricultural pollination, what companion species do we need to cultivate to sustain bee populations? All of these questions, pollen is a major component, but if we add other proxies, such as diatoms, water balance, certainly charcoal, insects, or the organic content of the sediments, is it highly organic, is in warmer periods or less so in colder periods? And certainly adding identification of seeds or leaves or needles. When you're looking at environments, wetland environments, where there are a lot of different kinds of sedges and different kinds of grasses, seeds are invaluable in helping to sort out those different species, whereas pollen can be very similar in structure. Seeds are much more distinct to work with. And with that, I'll welcome any questions, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. We've got a couple questions that we're going to wait until after Matthew's presentation. But thanks for that deep dive and some examples into palynology. I'll pass to John. You're going to introduce Matthew, and we'll take it from there.
Yes, I'm very excited to introduce Matt Vedibonker. He is a research assistant professor in the Earth Systems Research Center at the University of New Hampshire. Matt has worked on projects from the Amazon to the Arctic, but his work has mostly focused on understanding changes in the water, carbon, and nutrient cycles of New England's forests, especially in the context of past disturbances. Matt completed a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science with honors at Brown University in 2003 and received his PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences from the University of New Hampshire in 2013. Recent and current graduate student projects that he has supervised include studies of tree traits across climate gradients, the responses of maple and non-maple species to being tapped for syrup, tree physiological responses to drought, and the role of fire in promoting oak regeneration. Take it away, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Let me get this connected. So today I'll be talking about prescribed fire as a potential silvicultural tool as we think about managing red oak at and near its northern range limit, perhaps even beyond its northern range limit as we think about creating more climate-ready forest species compositions. So I'll acknowledge up front that this is work that was funded by the Northeastern States Research Cooperative and was done in cooperation with a group of collaborators. Con Tun, who's presented at NAFSE before, recently completed her master's at UNH. And I'd also like to specifically mention Nat Clevitt, who's a colleague of mine at Cornell and was really instrumental in pulling off this project. And also worth acknowledging are the many undergraduates who have assisted with collecting some of the data. And this is Con here, who led the field crews. So why northern red oak? Why are we interested in it? Well, especially thinking about climate zones moving northward and managing those northern forests, northern red oak is an attractive species because it's fast growing, has very high timber value. It has high wildlife value because of the large amounts of mass that it produces. In some ways, it might be a from that masting perspective, it might be almost a functional replacement for beech, which we're very concerned about with beech leaf disease coming through. Very importantly, it's a really adaptable species. You can grow it on almost any upland soil. It's not very particular as long as the soil isn't too wet. It's not the most fire tolerant of oak species, but relative to the northern hardwood species that predominate in northern New England, it is a very fire tolerant species. And it's also very tolerant of heat and drought because it roots more deeply than a lot of the competing species do. So I'm talking about the northern range limit. I figured I would just give you an idea of where that is. This is a pre-settlement forest reconstruction of New England, and the oaks end up getting lumped together in these, but you can see oaks are really dominant in southern New England, and a lot of that is probably due to forest history at the pre-settlement time period or early settlement time period the data come from. And oaks move into the Champlain Valley and up the Connecticut Valley, but typically it's sort of the southern edge of the White Mountains, and the margins of the Green Mountains are where its range limit would be. This has maintained itself pretty well. A more detailed look at the White Mountain National Forest and surrounding areas shows that pre-settlement, there was almost no oak, and where it did occur, it was really only in the very bottoms of those river valleys. It's a bit more abundant post-agricultural, maybe, so with climate change, over the last, or in a recent cycle of FIA, it's moved uphill a bit, but it's really still not an abundant player. Although there are some stands, as we'll see in some of these examples in this area, that have quite a bit of red oak, and good sized ones as well. So our main research questions are, compared with other forest management practices that might be used in this region, does prescribed fire promote and improve the growth of red oak seedlings? And if so, can we figure out how and why the fire is having that effect on the seedlings or on the community in general? There's a few hypotheses about what those mechanisms might be. There's some speculation that fire might be able to reduce the soil pathogen load, in particular root pathogens, which might have a disproportionate effect on seedlings relative to mature trees. Fire, of course, obviously liberates nutrients, makes them available after being locked up in slash and litter. It directly reduces the litter thickness, which is potentially an important limitation, especially on microsites that are a little bit wetter. Sometimes the litter thickness can become a barrier for the seedling to establish. It creates a drier soil surface, and in general, it can knock back and make a less hospitable set of conditions for some of the more mesic competition from other tree seedlings. And by those, I'm mostly talking about beech and red maple, although certainly there's others. So I'll be presenting some data from what I'm going to call our core 3 sites. And I'll show you some other sites a bit later. But the main sites we have most of our data from are in the western margin of the White Mountain National Forest. These are stands that John Neely had a hand in planning some prescribed burns. So roughly there were some different harvest treatments that were done between 2010 and 2014. And then some time period later, 5-6 years, there was a prescribed burn that came through in one of the stands in each of these pairs, which were otherwise treated similarly. So it sets up, there's not a lot of sites, but we have a really strong basis for making these comparisons of understanding the effect of a fire. And here are some results. I'll point out that in each of these figures, the burn stands are represented by the red color. The paired control stand is represented by blue. Each pair will have like this background shading that will carry through the different graphs. and it's just a box plot that shows the distribution. And we can see that the oak seedling density on average is about 3 times higher in the prescribed burn than in the reference control stand. This difference isn't individually significant for each stand, but we see a consistent pattern of the average in that burn stand being higher than in the control. We also see faster growth. This is measured as shoot extension of the 2024 twig growth. And that was done towards the end of the 2024 field season, early August. And again, across the board, we can see faster growth in the burn stand relative to the unburned. Other ways we measured size, the diameter at the root collar, and the number of leaves at the time we observed these. Again, really pretty clear and consistent differences, although, of course, a lot of variability across microsites and stands. We also put a lot of effort into aging these individual seedlings. And interpreting these can be a little bit tricky, but I'll walk you through it. The cleanest example we have is from this pair of shelter woods. The burn is indicated by this dashed red line. And you can see starting the year after the burn, there was about 4 years of really sustained, much higher oak seedling establishment. Whereas there was really not much of a difference, if any, prior to the burn. In some of these other stands, it's a little bit less clear. For example, this one has higher oak establishment both after and before the burn. So this is maybe a situation where the stands are not perfectly comparable, but this pattern would also be consistent with greater survivorship of seedlings that established early on, and not getting crowded out as quickly and surviving longer until we sampled them in 23 and 24. And we see a similar pattern in the seed tree harvest. Interestingly, the youngest seedlings were all in the control stand in that seed tree treatment, but it's important to remember that when you're looking at a 2 or 3 year old oak seedling, that's still on the very steep part of the mortality curve. And most seedlings that you observe at 2 to 3 years old will not still be there if you come back for 5 or 6 years. They tend to self-thin pretty quickly. So we see consistent data here with the idea that these ground fires are having a positive effect on oak survivorship and recruitment. This is our light availability data, and I'll just mention that this was measured and expressed as leaf area index. So the high values represent very dense shade, and a value of 0 would represent full sun. And again, in this case, across our 3 main study stands, we see that the burn stands have much higher light availability pretty uniformly, which is really important for oak establishment. We have a few additional sites on this graph that we're looking at for context. We opportunistically sampled a wildfire that occurred in 22 in Crawford Notch State Park. And interestingly, almost everything that's going on in these 3 stands, the big difference is the understory layer. It's competition with shrubs and other seedlings and maybe saplings. In this one, this big drop in leaf area increase in light availability is entirely due to canopy mortality. And I'll show you some photos of that in a minute. We also studied a couple of clear cuts at the Bartlett Experimental Forest, which had the same burned, unburned paired design. Unfortunately, we couldn't measure seedlings in these because there wasn't a good seed source and there were just very few seedlings in these. But they're a good reference for kind of a clear cut in northern hardwoods and what happens to the ground conditions when you burn it. Obviously, much more amenable to the establishment of a shade intolerant species in those burned stands. We also looked at soil nutrients, and I'll go through this quickly because we weren't able to conclude much from this. We sampled the top 4 inches of soil, or roughly what a 2 or 3 year old seedling would have access to in all of those stands, plus a couple of others. And we actually saw a lot of variability and not a really consistent effect. Maybe a suggestion that there's a little bit more nitrate available in the burn stands, but nitrate is a very small proportion of total available nitrogen in these forest soils. The phosphorus data was very noisy, so even though the average difference was 50%, it wasn't statistically significant. And there's maybe a suggestion of a decrease in potassium availability, but that was relatively modest as a change. So I mentioned that wildfire stand, and I'll use it as an example of another important point about regeneration and fire. This was the most severely burned place that I could see. And you can see a lot of the canopy trees have been killed by this. These three are oaks, and they were reflushing at the time that I visited, although there were a few oaks that were killed by this fire. Mostly what was killed was beech. And here it is from the top of the cliff, and you can see these areas of canopy mortality and also some reflushing that early. The reflushing was much stronger the following year. One of the things that happened that made this not a great wildfire in terms of oak being able to take advantage of it was that there was a very strong mast year in 2021, and this is what the acorns all looked like when they were on the ground, and that really strong wildfire came through. We didn't have another good mast year really until this year. It seems there was a small mast in 23, but at that point, there was already a lot of very dense competition and a lot of ground shading. So all of these cherry and aspen and sumac had a big head start on any of those acorns that happened to be trying to sprout in 24. And here's my most recent visit to the site, and you can see the cherries are already taller than I am. I'll briefly talk about another experiment that we did here as part of the same experiment. And the idea is that in a field study, it's really hard to separate out all the different things that change when a fire goes through. And so we decided to isolate just any changes in the soil and assess that with a potted seedling experiment. And so we collected acorns from 2 trees, and we collected soil from burned and unburned areas. And we grew these acorns into seedlings without any competition, all under the same light conditions, with only the difference in the soil, burned, unburned soil. And then we also oven sterilized some of those soil samples to try to figure out whether we could simulate any advantage of a burned soil by sterilizing a soil, if that's one of the potential thoughts, if that would be consistent with a pathogen effect. And we had a commercial potting mix as a control as well. What we found was surprising. In the unsterilized treatment, we saw that by about 2 months into planting, the burned soil seedlings were really fast, greatly outpacing those that were growing in the unburned soil. And so we thought this was consistent with our hypothesis that maybe there's a pathogen that the burning is reducing populations of. However, when we sterilized the soil, that effect completely disappeared. And so it's a little unclear what might be going on here. There might be some positive, some beneficial microbial community that was increased by the burning effect. However, we didn't see any difference in mycorrhizal colonization, for example. So it's not clear who that commensal or beneficial partner might be. And this is just the same results. So in conclusion, we see that oak seedling establishment, growth, and survival seem to be markedly improved following prescribed burns. This is most clearly attributed to greater light availability at the ground level and reduction in competition from other seedlings. And as I mentioned, the other seedlings that were most affected, most removed by this were beech and red maple. We didn't see at the plot scale really any relationship with the leaf litter thickness, so that might not be a mechanism that's really going on. We didn't see any difference in mycorrhizal colonization in the pots or in roots collected from the soil in the field sites. And our data are not consistent with the benefit being via reduction in soil pathogens, but maybe there's some sort of beneficial part of the soil community that's being improved by the burning. So our recommendations are that prescribed burns might be a helpful tool for maintaining or increasing oak in places that look like those that we studied. Might be a useful tool for assisted migration, establishing oaks in places that they don't already exist. Our benefits seem to be the clearest in the shelterwood systems, and timing, if we're going to rely on natural acorn regeneration, timing to mass events seems really critical to pulling this off successfully. And with that, I will. Oops. Thanks.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Matt, and thanks to all of our speakers. We've gotten some good questions in the chat so far. I'll go ahead and lead facilitation of this, and I think it might be best looking this over is start with a few questions that were about specific species, like the pitch pine or things that emerged during the pollen presentation. And then we can scale out to some of these other questions on process, and then thinking more broadly about what restoration goals are. We've had a few questions there. Let's see. So first question I'd ask of Andrea after your presentation came from Lisa Donor, and that is wild rice and sedge pollen useful for estimating drought conditions in these records? And don't forget to unmute.
Thank you. As far as the wild rice study is concerned, I think the answer to that is no. Because there were other influences over and beyond drought that was controlling the water levels within the estuary. So it was useful, I think, in showing land use relationships with wild rice, at least to a point, in that where you have more clearing, then you have more runoff. And, you know, there were changes when logging started in that area. But beyond that, in that particular study, I would say no, it doesn't really coincide with drought.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Let's pivot to Drew and ask this question from Shlomir Lightfoot. This is about the pitch pine populations. See, how do they persist on extremely xeric sites without fire to reproduce, despite cone serotiny being important to that?
That's a great question. I grossly simplified the idea of serotiny.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that it's not a yes or a no. Some populations have sort of more delayed cone opening, and some will not open at all until there's a fire. So it varies a lot. Like the New Jersey Pine Barrens, lots of serotiny. As you go north, less serotiny. Albany Pine Bush, apparently, I think not much serotiny. I think I have that right. I see Neil is on this. He could answer that. Arenate Acadia, a lot of, delayed opening. And I did notice some delayed opening for sure in the basin. So the places where it forms persistent populations, there is no evidence of cone serotiny. So, and also cone serotiny is correlated. This totally makes sense. It's correlated with fire frequency. You know, of course, if you have total cone serotiny and you have no fires, you're going to have no pitch pine. So yeah, a lot of variability, but those places where there are persistent populations, they are not fully serotinous.
Mhm. Thanks, Drew. While we have your attention, I'll go ahead and ask this question from Lisa as well, which is about fires and some of the ridgetop environments that you had looked at in your study. And that is, do fires burn hotter as they cross the ridges as they do in higher elevations out west?
I can't really answer that question. You would imagine so. But, you know, there certainly is drier conditions, so you would certainly expect that. But I don't have any data to really objectively answer that.
Mhm. All right, let's go to Neil. I see you just put a question in the chat for Matt on oak populations. And Matt, his comment was, "There's lots of good work in the central and southern USA with prescribed fire for oak establishment. Will you continue to look at fire and managing competitive advantage for oak dominance longer term?"
Yeah, I mean, our current funding is wrapping up. And so, yeah, we're working on thinking about what the next steps would be to come up with with a cleaner and better set of answers. A lot of the answers to these specific mechanisms might be really context dependent. And so we were happy to be able to get at least this project funded, despite the fact that this has been studied in great detail further south, where oaks are a bit more dominant.
Matt, I'd love to ask you too. I think I saw this question fleetingly in the chat, but it went away. But it piqued my interest on herbivory. Did you examine the role of herbivory at all in your study as a disturbance?
We didn't have any sort of a manipulation to try to separate out herbivory. So, I mean, one way of doing that would be like a deer exclosure type of experiment. We took some notes on whether the seedlings looked like they had been clipped back, which in many places, you know, deer herbivory is probably the dominant limitation on oak regeneration. We saw very limited evidence of that in these particular stands. So I don't think it's a huge part of it, but you can also imagine that, yeah, deer, if you have a more open environment in these burned places, deer might prefer them at certain times of the day or avoid them at other times of the day. So it could be part of it.
Mhm. Thank you. Let's see. Now let's get into the process a little bit. Shalmia Lightfoot has a question for Drew, which is, if we allow succession to proceed without fire, are we at risk of overshooting and dropping far below pre-colonization pitch pine levels?
I'm really glad you asked that question. And I really appreciate Neil's question as well. So that last slide of mine was my attempt to try to be an objective scientist and not like interject my opinion. I mean, my opinion is that, of course, we should be managing these places. If we're concerned about biodiversity at the local or regional level, these are really important places for these very important species. So very much, I feel like that is, you know, I find that a little dangerous. And I think we don't really have a fine-grained answer to how abundant pitch pine was. And we don't know what management, how the eventual abundance would compare to that. So I would say take a precautionary approach and care about biodiversity rather than, pre-Euro-American settlement benchmarks. So that's just my opinion. So thanks for those questions.
We can get into Neil's follow-up question from that, or actually series of questions, where he asked, what biodiversity would we lose? While pre-colonial is important context, does the contemporary biodiversity value prescribe management with fire, since these systems are reduced and degraded regionally? Does the changing context change the desirable future condition? And are we interested in restoring the past or protecting the future?
Yeah, I definitely, my value system is I'm more interested in protecting the future. I mean, it's easy to say that, it's complicated. But
Mhm.
in this case, I care more about, again, promoting the diversity of species on Phippsbrook Peninsula, in the region, etc. So I definitely err in that direction. Conditions have changed. We don't have the same environmental conditions that we've had in the past. We have a mixing of species, so we're creating whole new ecosystems. And so that is making me much more open to manipulation. Well, I won't go too long on this, assisted migration, etc., because whole new communities are being created. So I'm much more open to that than maybe I was 20 years ago.
Yeah, thanks. And Matt and Andrea, if you have any comments on that question as well, feel free to jump in. I'll take a final scroll for questions and make sure we capture them all. Let's see. For Andrea, so a little bit finer grained again on pollen ID. Are you able to distinguish the Pinus rigidia from Pinus banksiana in the pollen?
Yes, we can.
Mhm.
Actually, Rigider is that pollen is very distinctive. It's much larger. All four pollens have the same shape. They have the little bladders on the side. But Rigider is much larger. No, I'm sorry. Pitch pine is much larger than the other pollens. The distinction that's difficult to make is between red pine and jack pine, banksiana. And those, they can be differentiated as long as there isn't any hybridization going on with the red pine. And Drew published 2015, Drew, the pine differentiation. And it has the card analysis that we went through to do that. One cautionary note, though, is that this works, the differentiation for the pines work very nicely for the Northeast, but you can't take that data and apply it to the Midwest or around the Great Lakes, because there's just enough genetic difference between those populations that you have to do a whole new study when you move out of the immediate study area.
Mhm. All right, thanks for that, Andrea. And I think that's it for the questions. I told John and Eric to sort of follow behind me and just make sure I got everything, and I think I did. We are close to time as well, so thanks to so many participants for sticking with us for the hour and a half, being here to see our three awesome speakers. Thanks to our speakers for committing early and right away to helping host this mini symposium today. Eric, I don't know if you have any final thoughts or anything you want to say about the NAFSE, or if we've covered it.
I think we're good at this point, Katie.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks so much. It's been great to see so many fire friends in the chat and participant list. We'll reach out next time, and please use our working group listserv to make your own connections and share your own events.